Hey guys, tonight we're stepping quietly into a world of wool and linen, of delicate stitches, and the faint scent of sheep's lanolin carried on the wind. A world where clothing was never simply clothing, but a tool for survival, a sign of wealth, and sometimes a quiet act of beauty in a land where beauty was not always easy to come by. We'll be wandering through the wardrobes of the Viking Age, and I promise, what you find here might not be what you expect. Before we begin, if you feel like you've just settled into your favorite chair or tucked yourself under the covers, maybe take a moment to breathe and slow everything down. And if you like these gentle walks through the past, you can always join me again by subscribing. No rush, no pressure. Now, as the soft hum of the night surrounds you, imagine the creak of an old wooden loom, the muffled thud of boots on frozen ground, and the glint of a bronze brooch catching the pale winter light. Let's dim the brightness of the modern world, and together, we'll ease back into a time when the edge of the known world was stitched together one thread at a time. Let's set the scene. In the dim hush of long northern days, the fjords stretch like silent mirrors of grey-green waters beneath pale skies. Snow and mist cling to steep cliffsides of rock and pine, and the cold presses softly against the skin, not in sudden jarring gusts, but in a steady enveloping exhalation that seeps into bone and fleece alike. In such a place, clothing becomes more than an assemblage of fabric. It becomes a slow and living gesture toward survival, comfort, and a quiet fortitude. The land shapes the garments as much as the hands that weave them. This is a realm of endless winter light and the briefest dapple of summer warmth, where wool and linen and leather answer the call of the shifting seasons with gentle persistence. From the soft bristle of sheep carried over windswept ridges comes wool, the sinew of Viking life. It is sheared and washed and spun in the dim glow of fires, the fibers gradually drawn into yarn on upright looms that creak and sway in wooden halls. The weaver, methodical and unhurried, draws the shuttle through thread after thread, constructing broad swaths of cloth meant to resist cold and damp. Wool gives warmth even when it is soaked, and the Vikings knew that its dense air-trapping weave was worth the weight and labor it demanded. It was the fabric of their bodies, their sails, their daily armor against the sea and snow. But even in a land of deep cold, there were days when wool felt too heavy, too warm. Into those rare hours of temperate air, or the closeness of hearth-lit hallways, came linen, drawn from flax, harvested in the fleeting warmth of summer fields, retted in still water, beaten, and spun until the fibers lay smooth and fine. It was lighter, cooler, and breathed against the skin, carrying moisture away, a relief in the rare warmth of midsummer, or the press of a crowded home. Often it was reserved for those who could afford the effort and time it required, yet even humbler households might have a treasured length of linen for special garments or fine underlayers. Between the lighter linens and heavier wools lay blends of flax, hemp and nettle, fibers born of the same soil and water, often chosen for their hardiness. Hemp, once thought only fit for rope, also found its place in textiles, lending strength to cloth and sails alike. Nettle, when stripped of its sting and spun into fine threads, offered a surprisingly soft and durable alternative in times when wool was scarce or costly. The very cloth itself, coarse or fine, told of its maker and purpose. Wadmal, a thick, densely woven wool, was a staple across much of the Viking world. It was warm, sturdy, and plain, worn by farmers, fishers and sailors who needed protection above all else. In some regions, it served as currency, traded and measured by the ell, its worth understood without words. More delicate weaves were kept for garments of ceremony or status, layered beneath cloaks or shaped into finely draped dresses. Leather and fur added their own quiet resilience to the Viking wardrobe. Leather, tanned with patience and skill, became belts, boots, pouches and bindings. Fur, chosen as much for warmth as for beauty, was used sparingly, lining cloaks, edging hoods, trimming the cuffs of winter garments. It was never wasteful, never extravagant without reason. In a land where resources were hard won, every strip and scrap found its purpose. The landscape demanded layers, linen against the skin, wool over linen, leather or fur shielding the outermost edges. Long tunics hung to the knee or beyond, cloaks wrapped close around the shoulders, and brooches held the folds in place against the steady breath of the wind. Every garment spoke to the seasons, to the labor of weaving, to the rhythm of life in a place where winter's reach was long. Yet not all was muted. Though the land itself often wore the palette of stone, bark and water, the Vikings found ways to coax color into their clothing. Woad gave a deep blue, madder a rich red, weld a warm yellow. Greens were born of blending yellows and blues, purples from rarer and more costly dyes. These colors were not merely for decoration, they marked identity, status, and occasion. A brightly dyed cloak might be worn by a traveler returning from distant markets, a finely patterned dress by a bride, a rich red tunic by a chieftain during a feast. Clothing in this world was not a fleeting fashion, but a dialogue between body and environment, between necessity and quiet expression. It was made to last, to be repaired and re-dyed, to be passed down through seasons and generations. In the hum of the loom and the creak of the spinning wheel lay the knowledge of centuries, each thread tied to the land itself. And so, in this northern world, every stitch carried the wisdom of survival, every fold of cloth a promise against the cold. The garments were not just worn, they were lived in, weathered with the body, softened by the years, imbued with the scent of hearth smoke and sea air. It is from this understanding of place and need that we turn to the materials themselves, the tangible gifts of the land and the sea, and the ways the Vikings transformed them into the fabric of daily life. The materials that wrapped the Viking world were drawn from every corner of their environment, from the wind-swept hills that bred hardy sheep to the shifting waters that offered unexpected resources. They lived in a land where nothing was taken for granted, and where every fiber and hide came with a season's worth of labor behind it. Wool was their anchor, not only because it was warm and abundant, but because it seemed almost alive in its adaptability. The sheep that grazed across the rocky fields and narrow valleys carried thick, weatherproof coats, rich in lanolin, that helped repel rain and retained heat even when soaked. When the time came, shears whispered through the fleece in slow, deliberate movements, separating the wool without harming the animal, and leaving behind the faint scent of pasture and wind. Once gathered, the raw fleece was anything but ready to wear. Dirt, oil, and fragments of straw had to be teased out by careful washing, and the natural grease, sometimes left in for water resistance, sometimes removed for softness, was adjusted, depending on the garment's purpose. Women, and sometimes men, carded the wool in rhythmic strokes, aligning the fibers into smooth, workable lengths before twisting them into yarn. Each stage was measured in patience rather than minutes, the work often done in the low light of winter afternoons, with voices low, and the crackle of the hearth carrying across the room. Linen came from flax, a plant as unassuming in the field as it was essential in the household. Flax was sown in small, managed patches during the brief summer warmth. By the time the stalks were ready, their slender forms held long, fibrous strands hidden beneath the outer husk. Harvesting them required pulling the plants up by the roots to keep the fibers as long as possible. Retting followed, a process of soaking the stalks in ponds or slow-moving streams to loosen the binding tissues. The smell was earthy and sour, a reminder that transformation was rarely a pleasant process. Once softened, the stalks were dried, broken, and scraped to reveal the pale fibers inside. These were combed, spun, and twisted into thread, each step smoothing away coarseness until the linen could be woven into cool, strong fabric for undergarments, shirts, and finer dresses. From the forests and pastures came animal hides, each chosen according to its properties. Cowhide was thick and durable, suited for shoes, belts, and outer layers that needed to resist wear. Calfskin offered a finer texture for softer garments. Goatskin, more pliable and lighter, could be used for gloves or pouches. The hides were cleaned, scraped, and tanned, using methods that relied on bark, fat, and sometimes fish oil, substances that penetrated the fibers and preserved them against decay. This was not quick work. Tanning stretched over weeks or even months with regular turning, soaking, and drying. The result was leather that could bend and flex without cracking, able to endure years of use. Fur brought warmth to the harshest seasons, though it was never as common as modern imagination suggests. While it did serve as trim on cloaks or linings for boots, fur was valued and used sparingly. Squirrel pelts, fox fur, and sometimes even bear were traded and worn in the Viking world, but they were often seen more in the homes of the wealthy or on those traveling to colder, more exposed lands. A fur-lined hood or collar could mean the difference between enduring a winter journey and succumbing to frost. From the sea itself came one of the most unexpected materials, fish skin. This was no crude improvisation, but a carefully prepared leather, most often taken from large fish, such as salmon or cod. The skins were cleaned of scales and treated to create a tough, flexible material that could be used in boots, mittens, or waterproof wrappings. In coastal communities, this resource was practical and sustainable, making use of every part of a catch. In the damp, salt-heavy air of the North Atlantic, fish skin offered a degree of water resistance that land-based hides could not always match. Some materials arrived from far beyond Scandinavia. Through trade or the spoils of raiding, the Vikings acquired silk from the east, patterned fabrics from the British Isles, and fine wools from other parts of Europe. These were rare and prized, often cut into small pieces to be incorporated into trim, cuffs, or decorative panels rather than used for an entire garment. Even so, they spoke of distant lands and the wide reach of Viking influence. The preparation of these materials was rarely a solitary effort. Whole families participated. Children might help sort fibers or scrape hides, while skilled weavers and leatherworkers oversaw the finer steps. Knowledge was passed quietly from one generation to the next, woven into the rhythm of daily life. The transformation from raw resource to finished cloth or leather was not merely work, it was an act of shaping the environment into something human, something that could protect, warm, and identify the wearer. And so, the Viking wardrobe was not born of chance, but of centuries of refining these practices. Wool and linen, hides and furs, the occasional gleam of silk, each had its place, each carried the memory of labor and the touch of the land or sea that had given it. The finished materials would soon find their way to the loom or the workbench, ready to be turned into garments that were not just functional, but works of careful craftsmanship. From these resources, the Viking world moved naturally to the art that shaped them, the slow rhythm of spinning and weaving, where threads crossed and patterns emerged, and where clothing began to take on its final form. From the moment the wool was cleaned, or the flax was combed into smooth strands, the journey toward becoming cloth entered its most measured and meditative stage. Spinning and weaving were not the hurried tasks of idle hands. They were the pulse of domestic life, steady and unbroken, moving in time with the changing seasons and the long arc of years. In the Viking world, textiles were as essential as food or shelter, and their creation was a skill learned early, practiced daily, and carried with quiet pride. Spinning began with the spindle and whirl, a simple yet ingenious tool, no larger than the hand that held it. The distaff, often carved from wood, held the raw fibers, whether wool, flax, or a rare blend of both. A spinner would draw a small portion from the mass, twisting it between finger and thumb before letting the spindle take over, its weight pulling the fibers into a tightening thread. This process required an unbroken attention, though the hands often worked while the mind roamed freely, or while conversation moved softly between family members around the hearth. The spinner's fingers learned to feel the slightest irregularity in the thread, to judge when it was strong enough to wind onto the spindle, and to decide when the yarn was suited for warp, for weft, or for some more specialized use. Wool, with its crimp and resilience, spun into warm, forgiving yarn, while flax demanded a firmer, more deliberate touch. Linen threads were smooth and strong but less elastic, making them excellent for the structural warp threads of the loom. Nettle or hemp fibers, though less common, added their own properties, hemp especially valued for ropes and sailcloth. The quality of the yarn determined the quality of the cloth, and skilled spinners could produce fine, even threads that rivaled anything imported from abroad. Once spun, the yarn was wound into skeins, sometimes washed again to remove lingering oils or dirt, then dyed if color was desired. Some colors were worked into the thread before weaving, others would be added after the cloth was finished. Dyed yarns, especially in deep-lasting shades of blue, red or green, brought a quiet vibrancy to garments otherwise shaped by the muted tones of undyed wool or linen. The dyer's art was its own craft, but the spinner and weaver needed to understand how color behaved in the thread so that the patterns would emerge as intended on the loom. Weaving was the natural continuation of spinning, and in Viking homes, it was often done on the upright warp-weighted loom. This was a simple but elegant structure. A sturdy frame leaned against a wall, its vertical warp threads held taut by clay or stone weights tied at their ends. The weaver stood to work, passing the weft thread back and forth between the warp, beating each row into place with a smooth flat tool called a beater or sword. The steady beat, like a slow heartbeat, filled the quiet spaces of the home. The warp-weighted loom allowed for great versatility. Weavers could create narrow bands of patterned trim or wide lengths of heavy wool for cloaks. They could make the dense warm wadmal needed for working clothes or finer fabrics for dresses and tunics. Patterns could be simple stripes or intricate diamond weaves, achieved by manipulating the warp threads in different sequences. Even without the complex looms of later centuries, Viking weavers could produce cloth that was both durable and beautiful. Weaving was not merely a domestic chore, it was an economic activity. In some regions, cloth was produced in such quantity and quality that it was used as currency, traded for goods or services. A bolt of well-woven wool might be exchanged for grain, tools, or livestock. The ability to produce textiles gave households independence and bargaining power, and women, who often oversaw and directed textile work, held a significant role in maintaining the household's wealth. Textile production was also communal. While spinning was often a solitary or small group activity, weaving could bring together several people preparing the warp, measuring threads, adjusting weights. In larger settlements, weaving might be done in dedicated workshops where several looms stood side by side, their threads catching the light from open doorways or smoke-hole windows. Children grew up in these spaces, learning the feel of yarn in their hands, the sound of the loom's beat, and the slow satisfaction of cloth growing row by row. The work was physical as well as mental, standing for long hours, lifting and shifting the warp threads, and leaning into the loom required strength and endurance. In winter, the weaver's breath might fog in the cold air, while in summer, sunlight would slant across the loom, catching in the fibers and showing every uneven thread. Yet for those skilled in the craft, weaving was more than labor. It was a form of quiet creation, the shaping of raw material into something that would outlast seasons, journeys, and even the weaver herself. Once a length of cloth was finished, it was cut from the loom, and the raw edges were secured to prevent fraying. The fabric might be washed and beaten to soften it, or brushed to raise a nap for added warmth. It was then ready for the tailor's work, to be cut and sewn into tunics, dresses, cloaks, or other garments. In some cases, the cloth was stored until needed, rolled carefully, and kept in a dry place, where its value remained secure. The rhythm of spinning and weaving was a constant undercurrent in Viking life. It was work that did not cease with the seasons. If anything, winter brought more time for it, as fields lay dormant and sea travel slowed. The making of cloth was not hurried, because it could not be hurried. Each step depended on the one before, and the process resisted haste. The result was clothing that was deeply connected to the place and the people who made it. Every thread carried the memory of the hands that spun it, every length of cloth the echo of the loom's beat. Together, they formed the literal fabric of Viking existence, strong, practical, and often unexpectedly beautiful. And in the stillness of the weaving hall or the warm, smoky interior of a farmhouse, the Vikings shaped not only garments but the patterns of their own lives. From the looms and the halls, from the patient work of turning fiber into fabric, there was another step yet. The moment when these materials, still plain in their natural shades, would be transformed into something richer, something vibrant enough to catch the eye in the dim light of a winter feast, or the bright glare of summer sun. The transformation from raw, uncolored cloth into garments that carried the quiet richness of color was not merely a matter of ornament, but of skill, trade, and the patience to coax pigments from the most unassuming of sources. The image many hold of the Vikings, a people swathed in the dull greys and browns of rough homespun fabric, falters under the weight of archaeological evidence, which speaks in threads that have clung stubbornly to their hues despite the passing of 1,000 years. What emerges instead is a vision of a society that understood color not as mere decoration, but as a subtle statement of status, trade connections, and the rhythm of the seasons. The process began with the gathering of dyestuffs, a task that required a familiarity with the landscape as intimate as that of the shepherd or the fisherman. In summer, when the meadows were dotted with yellow bedstraw and the low hills were brushed with wild flowers, the women, for it was usually women, would collect plants whose value was known not for their fragrance or beauty, but for the pigment locked within their stems, roots, and petals. Birch leaves, when harvested young, could yield a clear, soft yellow, weld with its tall, spindly stalks, produced a brighter and more enduring shade of gold. Madder root, which had to be imported from warmer lands to the south, brought forth a deep, warm red when ground and boiled, while woad, grown in carefully tended patches and processed through a complex fermenting ritual, yielded the strong, enduring blues that often marked the garments of those of means. These colors were not accidental or simplistic. The Vikings understood that a single plant could yield different shades depending on the time of harvest, the preparation of the fibers, and the mordants used to fix the dye. Iron, copper, and alum, sometimes traded across long distances, acted as anchors that bound color to cloth, preventing it from fading under sun or salt air. This meant that a yellow obtained from birch leaves could, when treated with iron, deepen into a mossy green, while the same dye, when fixed with alum, remained bright and cheerful. Lichens, clinging stubbornly to seaside rocks, produced subtle purples and greys, shades that spoke quietly rather than shouted. The work of dyeing was slow, requiring heat, patience, and the willingness to stand over steaming vats for hours at a time, turning and lifting the fabric until it drank its fill of color. The scent of the dye pots could vary from pleasant, as with flowers and herbs, to pungent and almost overpowering when dealing with woad or certain lichens. In small farmsteads, the process took place in large cauldrons over open hearths. In larger settlements, dedicated dye houses existed, their interiors dim and warm, the walls stained faintly from years of vapor and splashing pigment. In both settings, dyeing was a craft passed down through generations, each practitioner inheriting the small refinements of method that kept colors strong and lasting. The result was a society where garments could carry subtle messages through color alone. Deep blues and rich reds were not commonplace. They suggested either access to imported dyestuffs or the wealth to trade for them. Yellows and browns, though more common, were still carefully varied to suit personal taste or occasion. Even undyed wool, left in the natural cream, grey or brown of the sheep, was valued for the way it blended harmoniously with dyed trim braids or embroidery. This understanding of contrast and combination meant that Viking clothing often displayed layers of subtle visual interest. A tunic of muted brown linen might be edged with a narrow band of bright red wool. A cloak of deep blue could be lined with pale undyed fleece. Such choices also connected to the seasons. In the darker months, when the sun was low and light scarce, the richer, deeper tones seemed to absorb and hold warmth. In summer, lighter shades caught and reflected the sunlight, offering some relief from heat. These cycles reinforced the relationship between Viking clothing and the rhythms of their environment. The same environment that provided both the raw materials and the dyes themselves. Trade routes further expanded the palette. Silk threads dyed with saffron or cochineal, brought from lands far to the south and east, were rare treasures, used sparingly to add narrow lines of brilliant color to high-status garments. Such threads might appear only in embroidery, or in the woven bands that trimmed cloaks and tunics, but their presence was unmistakable. They spoke of ships that had crossed distant seas, of markets crowded with goods from across the known world, and of the wealth required to acquire them. Over time, the ability to create and maintain bright, lasting colors became not just a matter of skill but also of identity. The archaeological discovery of vividly dyed textiles in Viking graves, some still displaying reds, blues, and yellows after centuries underground, challenges the modern tendency to imagine them in a monotone world. These fragments tell a different story, one in which color was cherished, where a cloak or tunic could be both functional and beautiful, and where clothing was one of the few forms of personal expression available in a society bound by strict hierarchies and communal life. The knowledge of dyes also intersected with superstition and symbolism. Certain shades were thought to carry protective qualities or to signal particular roles within the community. A blue cloak might be linked to authority or leadership, while a red band could suggest vitality or a readiness for conflict. Whether these associations were rigid or fluid likely varied between regions and generations, but the presence of color as a signifier was part of the unspoken language of Viking dress. In this way, Viking clothing was never just about surviving the elements, it was also about participating in a visual tradition that balanced practicality with an appreciation for beauty. To walk through a settlement on a clear day would have been to see not a sea of drabness, but a living mosaic of earth tones, bright accents, and the occasional flash of something extraordinary, a reminder that even in a landscape of rock, ice and wind, the human eye still longed for, and created moments of color. The cloth once dyed, moved into the hands of skilled needleworkers, whose task it was to shape and embellish it into garments that would endure both use and weather, and it is here, in the realm of cut and form, that the next part of the story unfolds. In the chill of the northern air, where winds carried the salt of the sea even far inland, the everyday dress of Viking men was an unspoken balance between necessity and quiet pride. Their garments were not the stiff, formal uniforms of courts or temples, nor the ragged improvised coverings of the desperate, but instead, something that sat in the middle, practical, layered and durable, yet still made with a certain attention to the way fabric fell, the way colors complemented one another, and the way a figure appeared against the light of a low winter sun. Clothing was, after all, the first barrier between the body and the cold, but it was also a quiet form of self-expression, the details of which would be noticed in the long communal halls where people gathered to eat, trade and tell stories. The foundational layer for most men was the tunic, a simple T-shaped garment that reached to mid-thigh, or sometimes just above the knees, depending on the man's work and preferences. Made most often from wool, it was warm without being too heavy, able to trap heat in the long months of frost, yet breathable enough to be worn during the brief northern summers. The cut was straightforward but never careless. The shoulders were shaped to allow movement, the sleeves narrowed toward the wrists, so they could be pushed up when work required bare forearms, and the neckline might be slit down the front a short way, closed with a small tie, or left open to allow easier movement. Beneath this tunic, many wore an undertunic of linen, smoother against the skin, and capable of wicking away moisture, an important consideration in a climate where sudden shifts from cold to warmth could lead to discomfort or illness. Below the waist, Viking men favored wool trousers, which came in different styles depending on regional traditions and available resources. In some areas, looser trousers were preferred, gathered at the ankle, and sometimes reinforced at the knees with extra patches of cloth or leather. In other places, a tighter fitting style was worn, providing greater mobility for riding or climbing. These trousers were often secured with a simple drawstring or a woven belt, from which a knife, pouch, or small tools could be suspended. Beneath the trousers, linen undergarments might be worn, though the evidence for these is sparse, and the practice likely varied with wealth and season. Over the tunic, especially during colder days, a man might wear a cloak, a rectangular or semicircular piece of thick wool fastened at the shoulder with a brooch or pin. This fastening at the shoulder, rather than the front, allowed one arm to remain free for work or for carrying weapons, while the fabric draped diagonally across the body, shielding the core from wind. The cloaks varied in length, some swept almost to the ankles for maximum warmth, while others stopped around mid-thigh for greater ease of movement. In the winter, these cloaks could be lined with animal fur, fox, sheepskin, or occasionally more exotic pelts acquired through trade, adding another layer of insulation against the cold. On their feet, Viking men wore shoes of soft leather, often stitched from a single piece with seams at the sides and sole. For heavier use, Boots with higher ankles and thicker soles might be worn, especially in marshy or snowy terrain. Inside, woven socks or strips of wool wound around the feet provided extra padding and warmth. Leatherworking skill was valued, for a poorly made shoe could quickly split or allow in water, leading to cold injury in a land where frostbite was never far from mind. Even the simplest outfits often carried subtle embellishments. A tunic hem might be edged with tablet-woven braid in contrasting colors, not merely to add beauty, but also to strengthen the edge and prevent fraying. Belts could be plain strips of leather, but they were often decorated with stamped patterns or fitted with buckles of bronze, iron, or occasionally silver, depending on the owner's means. Cuffs and collars might be reinforced with colored wool or linen, creating a frame of hue against the more muted tones of the main garment. Color itself was a matter of quiet pride. While some might imagine Viking clothing as entirely grey or brown, in reality, men wore earthy reds, soft blues, warm yellows and deep greens, especially in settled communities where access to plant-based dyes was reliable. Wealthier men, or those with trade connections, could afford richer, more saturated colors. A tunic of deep crimson, for example, might have been a sign of both prosperity and connections beyond the local fjord. Even so, the need for practicality kept patterns simple. Plaids, stripes and checks existed, but they were subdued, meant to blend with the natural environment rather than dazzle. Dress also carried subtle markers of age, role, and status. A young man in his prime might wear trousers that allowed freer movement, ready for travel or work in the field. An older man might favor heavier cloaks and more substantial layers, perhaps woven for him by family members as a sign of care. The materials, cut and condition of the clothing spoke quietly to others. A tunic patched at the elbows might tell of hard, repeated labor, while one with elaborate braid edging might hint at a man who had traveled, traded, or commanded enough resources to spend time on such details. Viking men dressed not for ornament alone, but for the practical reality of their daily lives. Farming, fishing, shipbuilding, and long sea journeys all demanded clothing that would not hinder the body or fail under strain. The garments were made to last, to be repaired, to be handed down or refitted when needed. Yet within that framework of necessity, there was room for individuality, in the choice of colors, the way a cloak was fastened, the braiding at the tunic's hem, or the selection of a particularly fine belt buckle. Clothing became a conversation between climate, craft and personal identity, a conversation played out silently in wool, linen and leather against the backdrop of the north's shifting skies. And as men moved through their villages or across distant shores, the same principles that guided their everyday dress also shaped the garments of the women who lived alongside them, for the needs of warmth, protection and durability were shared across the community. The clothing of Viking women, though often practical in nature, held a quiet elegance that spoke not only to the demands of survival in the north, but also to the intricate social codes woven into everyday life. In the lands of the fjords, where wind-swept salt spray from the sea, deep inland and winters seemed reluctant to release their grip, women dressed with a careful balance between warmth, utility, and cultural expression. This was not a culture of waste, where wardrobes overflowed with idle finery. Each garment was deliberate, the product of long hours of work, and once worn, it often carried with it meanings that could be read like the subtle turns of a saga. At the core of a woman's attire was the underdress, typically made of linen in the warmer months and wool during colder seasons. Linen offered a soft, breathable layer close to the skin, protecting against irritation from the heavier fabrics worn above. The wool underdress, by contrast, added insulating warmth, its weave dense enough to trap air, but still allowing for a degree of flexibility and movement, necessary in a life where one might shift from tending livestock to grinding grain in the course of a morning. Over this base layer came the garment most closely associated with Viking women in both archaeological finds and historical reconstructions: the apron dress, sometimes called the hangrock. This was a sleeveless overdress, often crafted from high-quality wool, cut with enough width to allow free movement, but shaped to hang smoothly down the figure. It was suspended from the shoulders by a pair of straps, which were fastened to the front with distinctive oval brooches, metalwork items that have been found in abundance in Viking graves. These brooches, often made of bronze or silver, were more than functional fasteners. They were canvases for decoration etched with interlaced designs, animal motifs, or even inlaid with enamel or glass. Their weight pulled the fabric into soft folds, which not only gave the dress a pleasing drape, but also allowed air to circulate, important in a climate where one could move from the chill outdoors into the warmth of a hearth in a matter of steps. The apron dress could be plain, in the case of poorer households, but among those of higher standing, it was often enriched with woven bands, embroidery, or borders dyed in contrasting colors. The positioning and style of these decorations could communicate more than mere taste. They might signal regional identity, the skill of the household's weavers, or more subtly the resources a family had to invest in such embellishment. Beneath the apron dress, and sometimes tucked into its folds, women wore belts or girdles from which hung small tools or personal items, a knife in a sheath, a key to a storeroom, a needle case. These were not merely accessories but symbols of responsibility and authority within the household, particularly the key, which in Viking society often marked a woman as the keeper of the family's food stores and valuables, a role of significant importance. Seasonal variations were necessary in a world where summer was short and winter seemed to stretch endlessly. In colder weather, a woman might add a wool cloak, pinned at the shoulder with a brooch, or a hood lined with fur. Cloaks could be rectangular or semicircular, and the choice might depend on local tradition or personal preference. Mittens, sometimes made from sheepskin or felted wool, were essential for working outdoors, as were sturdy leather shoes or boots. The shoes were often lined with moss or wool for insulation, and while their shapes were plain, the stitching was durable, meant to withstand long walks over uneven terrain. Even in the humbler layers of society, clothing carried subtle messages. Married women generally wore their apron dress in the traditional brooch-fastened style, while unmarried women might wear a simpler overdress or shift, sometimes with decorative beads strung between the brooches, if they could afford them. Beads were not mere ornamentation. They often served as amulets or markers of wealth, and their colors, whether pale amber from Baltic shores, vivid blues from imported glass, or deep green from serpentine stone, were chosen with care. The act of wearing them was not simply for beauty, but as part of a quiet but constant communication of identity, status, and sometimes belief. Textile choices also reflected the realities of daily work. While higher status women might own garments of fine soft-spun wool, much of the population wore coarser cloth. These fabrics could be scratchy to the touch, but were long-lasting, resisting the wear that came from farm labor, fishing, or the endless domestic tasks of cooking, weaving, and preserving food. Clothing was not discarded lightly. Worn garments might be patched, re-hemmed, or cut down to fit younger members of the household. In this way, clothing also carried memories. An apron dress might begin its life as part of a wedding trousseau, and end it as a child's winter tunic. It is worth noting that in Viking society, clothing was also part of burial rites. Many of the surviving examples of women's dress have come from graves, where bodies were laid out in their best attire. The presence of elaborate brooches, beads, and decorated textiles in these burials suggests that for women, as for men, clothing was a key aspect of both public identity and the image they carried into death. In some graves, the brooches still fastened the straps of the apron dress, their placement allowing modern archaeologists to reconstruct the cut and drape of the garment. The quality of the wool, the weave of the linen, and the presence of imported dyes or beads all contribute to our understanding of how Viking women lived and how they wished to be remembered. For all its elegance, women's dress in the Viking Age remained firmly rooted in function. It was clothing designed for a life of physical demands, made with an eye toward both warmth and mobility. Yet within those constraints, women found space for beauty and self-expression. The choice of color, the arrangement of brooches, the addition of beads or patterned borders, these were all ways in which a woman could shape her presentation to the world, subtly signaling her place within the community. It is a reminder that even in a society often defined by the exploits of warriors and the harshness of its environment, there was room for craft, care, and individuality. As the seasons turned, and the air began to bite once more, women would layer themselves in garments that felt as familiar as the walls of their own homes, each fold and fastening a part of daily rhythm. The next layer of the story lies not in these practical yet symbolic clothes, but in the more striking and often misunderstood attire reserved for special occasions, celebrations, and moments of communal gathering, where the everyday gave way to the ceremonial and fashion took on an entirely different kind of significance. In the long stretch of months when the days were bright, and the air carried a gentle warmth, Viking clothing shifted toward lighter and more breathable fabrics, a quiet adaptation to the passing of the seasons that reflected an understanding born from centuries of life in northern latitudes. Linen, woven from flax grown in the short but intense summers, became the favored material when the sun rode high and the air was sweet with the smell of grass and salt from the distant coast. These linen garments were cut more loosely than the thick winter woolens, allowing a movement of air over the skin that was as much a comfort as it was a necessity during the brief spell when labor could continue from dawn until near midnight, without the chill forcing a return to the fire. Men would wear tunics of this cooler fabric, sometimes belted at the waist, while women's dresses, still layered and dignified, were of a lighter weave, their threads dyed with the plant-based colors gathered during the spring, giving the summer months a palette of gentle blues, soft yellows, and warm reds. Yet, even in these brighter days, the notion of layering remained, for the Vikings understood that weather could turn without warning. A sudden wind rolling off the sea or descending from the mountains could strip the warmth from a day in moments, and for this reason, linen shirts might still be paired with thin woolen cloaks or wraps that could be easily shed and carried over the arm when the sun returned. Children, who were perhaps more vulnerable to the shifts in temperature, would be dressed in similar layers, light tunics over soft undergarments, so they could play outside without fear that a change in weather would send them shivering indoors too soon. In summer, footwear might also be lighter, soft leather shoes instead of the thicker fur-lined boots that were essential in winter, but always sturdy enough for the rocky paths and uneven ground that marked the Scandinavian landscape. When the wheel of the year turned again toward autumn, a subtle transformation began. The linen, still in use, would often be worn under thicker wool garments, signaling the gradual build toward winter. This transitional period was a time of preparation, both in the fields and at the loom, for the deep cold was never far off. Women would bring out the heavier cloaks, often stored away during the warmer months, shaking out the faint scent of wood smoke from last winter's fires. Mittens and caps, knitted or sewn from leftover scraps of wool and fur, would begin to make their appearance, not yet in full daily use but ready for the first frost that would soon creep across the fields at dawn. Men might don heavier trousers, lined or doubled with a second layer, especially if their work took them out to sea, or into the forests where wind could strip warmth faster than any hearth could replace it. As autumn deepened and the light shortened each day, the true winter clothing emerged, a form of armor against the cold that was both practical and in its way beautiful. Cloaks were now thick, woven from the densest wool, often doubled and sometimes lined with fur from sheep, goat, or reindeer. These cloaks were pinned or tied securely at the shoulder, allowing one arm to remain free for work or weapons if needed, but also creating a barrier against the biting winds. Hoods were common, either attached to cloaks or worn separately, designed to trap the heat of breath and shield the face from icy gusts. Beneath all this, layers multiplied. A linen shirt against the skin, followed by a long-sleeved wool tunic, then a shorter, thicker over-tunic for additional insulation. Wool trousers or leggings were worn over linen or softer wool underlayers, and the seams were often reinforced to withstand not only the wear of movement, but the relentless cold. Footwear in winter was critical, and here the ingenuity of the Vikings was clear. Soft leather shoes or boots, lined with fur and stuffed with dried grass or moss for insulation, kept feet warm even on snow-packed ground. In harsher conditions, additional wraps of wool or leather might be tied around the lower legs, serving as both protection from snowdrifts and extra reinforcement against the cold seeping up from the ground. Hands were protected with mittens, often made from a single piece of leather or thick felted wool, which trapped warmth far better than gloves with separate fingers. In an extreme cold, mittens could be lined with fur and even worn inside one another, creating a double layer much like the clothing elsewhere on the body. Children, again, were a special consideration. In winter, they were often dressed in garments handed down from older siblings, each year adding a new patch or stitch to maintain them. Furs were especially valued for the youngest, as they provided warmth even when damp from melting snow. Babies and toddlers might be wrapped entirely in fur cloaks when outside, with only their faces visible beneath a small hood, while older children learned early to manage their own layers, adding or removing garments as they moved between indoors and out. Seasonal clothing was not merely a response to temperature, but also a reflection of resource management. The same cloak might serve for years, repaired as needed, and layers allowed garments to be used across multiple seasons, simply adjusting the number worn at any given time. In this way, clothing became part of the cycle of life, woven in spring, worn in summer, strengthened for autumn, and tested in the deep trials of winter. The skill lay not only in making garments warm or cool enough for the season, but in creating them to last through the changing months, adaptable to the shifting needs of a land where the weather was as much a constant companion as the sea and the mountains. By the time the first true snow blanketed the ground and the fjords froze at their edges, the layering reached its fullest expression. In the dim light of a winter morning, a Viking could step from their home into air that bit sharply at exposed skin, and yet remain protected and mobile, the combination of layers forming a system that balanced warmth, comfort, and the ability to work. Whether hauling nets across frozen beaches, tending to livestock in snow-covered pastures, or traveling between settlements over ice-slick trails, these seasonal adjustments in clothing were as essential as the food stores in the cellar or the wood stacked by the hearth. Without them, survival would be impossible, for the cold here was not a fleeting discomfort, but a deep, enduring presence that could not be ignored. And so, the rhythm of dressing through the year became another of the countless ways the Vikings lived in harmony with their land. It was not a matter of chasing fashion in the modern sense, but of shaping one's appearance and comfort to the environment, an unspoken conversation between fabric and weather, between the maker's hands and the season's demands. In the end, it was this understanding of seasonal adaptation that laid the foundation for the finer details of Viking attire, allowing for the more specialized and symbolic garments that emerged in other aspects of their lives. Yet, as the last of the autumn leaves gave way to the pale hush of early winter, the Viking figure, whether farmer, trader, or seafarer, was not defined solely by the warmth of the layers they wore. Clothing might guard the body against the elements, but it was the glint of metal at the shoulder, the subtle chime of beads across the chest, and the reassuring weight of a silver band at the wrist that completed the image of a person in this world. Jewelry, to the Viking mind, was not a frivolous indulgence for idle vanity. It was a tool, a language, and in many ways a lifeline. Consider the brooch, that seemingly simple fastening device which to modern eyes might appear little more than a decorative pin. In the Viking Age, these brooches, often crafted from bronze, silver, or on rarer occasions gold, were engineered to secure layers of heavy fabric in place. A cloak draped over the shoulders in winter was far more than a loose blanket. Without a well-made brooch, it could slip, tangle, or flap dangerously in the wind. The brooch solved this practical problem, but in the process, it became a canvas for artistry. Some were shaped like shields or beasts, engraved with knotwork patterns that seemed to twist endlessly, reflecting a belief in cycles and eternal bonds. Others were domed and studded with glass or amber, catching sunlight in warm glows that stood in stark contrast to the pale, cold landscapes around them. Women's attire, with its iconic apron dress, relied heavily on a matched pair of oval or tortoise brooches at the shoulders, from which strands of beads could be strung. These beads, some carved from bone, others rolled from imported glass, or even shaped from semi-precious stones, were more than pretty trinkets. They told a silent story of journeys taken, trades made, and connections forged across seas and distant markets. A strand of bright blue glass beads might whisper of a merchant ship that once sailed from the Mediterranean. A single amber bead might recall the rich golden resin gathered along the Baltic shores. In this way, jewelry was as much a record of travel and status as it was an adornment. Then there were the arm rings and neck rings, solid bands of twisted silver or bronze, sometimes simple, sometimes lavishly worked. Their circular form echoed the value placed on completeness and unity, but their most immediate function was entirely practical. They served as portable wealth. In a time before coinage was universal in Scandinavia, such rings could be cut into smaller pieces to pay for goods or services. The term hack silver comes from this very practice, as arm rings could be physically hacked apart to create instant currency. To wear one was to carry one's bank account on the body, an asset that could feed a family, secure passage on a ship, or pay the bride price in a marriage agreement. Pendants, too, carried layered meanings. A small Thor's hammer, the Malurnia, might hang from a cord around the neck, worn for protection, and as a declaration of loyalty to the old gods during a time when Christianity was beginning to ripple into Viking lands. Animal-shaped pendants could invoke certain traits: the fierce strength of a bear, the keen vision of a raven, the resilience of a wolf. Some pendants bore geometric or spiral designs, perhaps representing the turning of the seasons or the unending journey of the soul. Whether cast in bronze for everyday wear or made of silver for ceremonial use, these pendants rested close to the heart, both literally and in meaning. Even the smallest items, the pins, buckles, and buttons, carried aesthetic and symbolic weight. A simple cloak pin might be inscribed with runes, acting as a talisman, each letter a prayer for safety or luck. A belt buckle could feature a motif recalling a saga hero or a scene from mythology, quietly reminding the wearer of the virtues they sought to embody. Such details were rarely accidental. They were intentional, as much a part of the person's public identity as their voice or their walk. But jewelry in Viking society was not static. It passed from hand to hand, down through families, or was given as a gift to secure alliances. A warrior might be rewarded with an arm ring from his chieftain, a public symbol of loyalty and honor. A bride might bring her family's brooches into her new home, merging her lineage's symbols with those of her husband's. Traders might carry extra beads or small silver trinkets, knowing such items could smooth negotiations in distant markets. Each piece of jewelry was in essence a small knot tying together personal history, community ties, and the broader tapestry of the Viking world. And while these adornments glittered in firelight or caught the pale gleam of a northern sunrise, their significance was not merely in their beauty, but in the conversations they started and the statements they made without words. A man whose cloak was clasped with a heavy silver brooch engraved with serpents might silently declare his status and wealth before speaking a single word. A woman whose beads were strung with rare stones might be recognized instantly as part of a household with far-reaching trade connections. To the Vikings, appearance was a language, and jewelry was a vocabulary every bit as important as speech. It was a language they understood intuitively, one that could change with the turning of the seasons, the forging of new alliances, or the arrival of a ship heavy with goods from distant lands. Jewelry was alive with meaning, a conversation between the wearer and the world, between the past and the present, and just as the glint of a brooch or the chime of beads could catch the attention of a neighbor across a crowded gathering, so too could the shimmer of a finely worked blade at a warrior's side tell a story of artistry and pride, because in the Viking world, beauty was not confined to cloth and ornament. It was etched into the very tools they carried into life's most uncertain moments. Leather, in the hands of a skilled Viking craftsman, could be coaxed into forms both humble and regal, a material that bridged the gap between the dirt-streaked fields and the polished floors of chieftains' halls. Footwear was never an afterthought in this world of relentless movement and shifting terrain. It was as necessary as a shield or a cloak. In the villages scattered along the coasts and deep inland near winding rivers, the smell of tanned hides often drifted on the air, sharp and earthy, announcing the work of those who labored to make sure feet stayed dry, warm and uninjured, in a climate that did little to offer kindness. For most, shoes were simple creations, low leather forms stitched together from pieces cut with care to waste as little hide as possible. They might have been fastened with a drawstring of twisted leather thong, or held in place by a modest strip that crossed the instep. The soles, often a single thickness of hide, would soften and wear thin with the passing months, meaning that repairs or replacements were a common part of life. On damp ground, these simple shoes absorbed the wet, their fibers swelling and darkening, and so they needed frequent drying by the hearth, where the leather would stiffen and then be flexed back into shape by hand before the day's work began again. For those of higher means, footwear became a statement as much as a necessity. Boots might rise to mid-calf, or even higher, their shafts cut from supple hides treated with oils that gave them a rich, dark sheen. Decorative stitching could trace along seams in intricate patterns, sometimes in contrasting thread, a display of the owner's status and the shoemaker's pride. Edges could be scalloped, reinforced, or even adorned with small discrete bits of metalwork. The wealthiest might possess more than one pair. Boots for travel, for feasting, for winter hunting, each with its own careful balance between function and ornament. Some were made from reindeer or calfskin, prized for softness and flexibility, the leather yielding easily to the wearer's movements. The making of these shoes and boots required not only hides but also the knowledge of tanning, a process that took weeks of soaking, scraping and treating with bark tannins or other solutions to prevent rot and make the leather more durable. The work was not pleasant. The smell could cling to the hands and clothing of the tanner, but it was indispensable. Without well-prepared hides, no cobbler could produce footwear that would withstand the journey to market, the trek to distant farms, or the long voyages by sea. Seafaring brought its own demands. A sailor's shoes or boots needed to resist not only the cold spray of the waves, but also the wear of rope, salt and shifting deck planks. Some may have lined their footwear with wool, or stuffed it with dry grass for insulation, an old practice that persisted in the colder reaches of the north. Others might go barefoot on deck for better grip, preserving their footwear for land travel. The sea was harsh on leather, and a single long voyage could reduce a pair to ruin if not maintained. In winter, footwear often gained a second skin, a wrapping of fur or thick wool secured around the outside, sometimes bound with strips of hide to keep the snow from finding its way in. For those who lived where winters were especially cruel, entire boots might be fur-lined, the soft inner side against the foot providing a buffer against frostbite. These too spoke of status, for fur-lined boots required more material, more time, and more resources to produce. Footwear could also serve as a form of portable wealth. Well-made boots, especially those decorated with colored stitching or unusual patterns, could be traded, gifted, or inherited. They traveled across generations, their leather softened by the steps of fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, each owner adding their own wear to the shape. The fit, once molded to one foot, might feel strange to the next wearer, but the value remained. In a world where metal coinage was not always abundant, fine goods, including shoes, could be as good as silver in the right circumstances. Even in death, some were buried with their shoes, a sign that these were not merely practical objects, but companions for the journey into the next world. The presence of finely made boots in graves tells us that for some, appearance and craftsmanship mattered even in the shadow of eternity. Archaeological finds have revealed shoes still bearing traces of the hands that made them, the stitching holding fast after centuries, the patterns faint but visible, like echoes of a vanished life. And as much as these objects tell us about the people who wore them, they also reveal something about the world in which they lived, a world where every step might be across frozen ground, sodden marsh, sharp stone, or the creaking boards of a longship, and where what protected your feet could mean the difference between moving forward and being left behind. In this way, footwear was not an accessory to Viking life, it was a foundation. From the soles that pressed into the earth to the carefully bound tops that sealed in warmth, these shoes and boots were part of a larger whole, a full picture of dress and appearance that told others who you were, what you could afford, and where you had been. Just as a finely tooled brooch or a string of colored beads could speak volumes, so too could the cut of a boot, or the simplicity of a shoe, each a silent messenger about its wearer's place in the weaving of Viking society. And in that society, where appearance met survival, the same care and pride extended upward from the feet to the head, for the hair and headwear of the Vikings carried their own meanings, both practical and symbolic. The Vikings, often imagined by later generations as wild-haired, unkempt warriors emerging from the misty decks of their longships, were in reality a people who placed notable importance on their personal grooming and presentation, a fact that has been increasingly confirmed through archaeological discoveries, surviving artifacts, and contemporary accounts from those who encountered them. In settlements across Scandinavia, from the bustling trade hub of Hedeby to the remote farmsteads of the Lofoten Islands, the ground has yielded a wealth of personal care items: combs carved from antler or bone, delicate ear spoons, small tweezers, and even razors, each crafted with a surprising level of artistry and precision, hinting at a daily culture of self-maintenance that may have been as ingrained as tending a fire or mending a garment. These objects, worn smooth by years of use, speak to a people who not only endured the harsh conditions of their northern homeland, but also took deliberate steps to manage their appearance within those constraints. For the Viking man or woman, hair was not a neglected mass hidden beneath grime, but an extension of identity, shaped, cleaned, and arranged in ways that could convey rank, desirability, or readiness for the day's work or trade. It is worth remembering that the Viking Age spanned centuries and encompassed diverse regions, meaning hairstyles and grooming habits likely varied between communities, yet certain patterns emerge in the surviving evidence. Men are thought to have worn their hair in styles that were both practical and distinctive, shorter on the back and sides for ease under a helmet, yet longer, and sometimes intricately arranged on top to signal individuality or status. This description aligns with the famous account of the Anglo-Saxon chronicler, who remarked upon the Northmen's habit of combing their hair daily and bathing weekly, much to the chagrin of English husbands who felt their wives were overly charmed by these well-groomed foreigners. The idea of weekly bathing might seem modest by modern standards, yet it was notably frequent compared to many contemporaneous European populations, whose water use and hygiene practices were more limited due to cultural or practical constraints. For Viking women, hair was often worn long and well-maintained, with braids and twists that could be simple for everyday work or more elaborate for gatherings and feasts, sometimes adorned with ribbons, beads, or even fine metal wire. Such embellishments not only added beauty, but also reinforced the impression of orderliness, skill, and cultural belonging. Grooming, however, was not confined to hair. Beards, an emblematic feature in popular Viking imagery, were themselves subject to deliberate shaping and care. The beard could be cropped close, left full, or trimmed into defined lines, each style potentially signaling age, temperament, or personal taste. A well-kept beard required tools, and indeed, archaeological digs have uncovered small shears and sharp knives that might have been used for trimming, alongside the aforementioned combs and tweezers. These tweezers, often small enough to be worn on a cord at the belt, served the dual function of removing unwanted facial hair and maintaining neat brows, actions that would have been undertaken in private, but whose effects were visible to the wider community. Cleanliness extended beyond the visible. Ear spoons, thin and curved at one end, were designed for clearing the ear canal, reflecting a meticulous attention to personal comfort and hygiene that transcended mere vanity. One must also consider the role of social interaction in sustaining these habits. In the close-knit environment of a Viking household or ship crew, personal appearance would have been a shared concern, not only because individuals represented themselves, but also because they reflected upon the honor and standing of their group. A disheveled or dirty individual might be perceived as careless, sickly, or lacking discipline, qualities undesirable in a world where reputation could mean the difference between trade partnership and exclusion, or between marriage prospects and solitude. Grooming thus had a social utility. It smoothed interactions, projected competence, and reinforced a sense of collective identity, whether at home in the fjords or abroad in the markets of Dublin, or the courts of the Rus. The comb, in particular, emerges as a symbol of this cultural value. Viking combs were often carried as personal items, sometimes tucked into a pouch or hung from the belt, always ready for use. They were crafted with precision, their teeth fine enough to work through tangles, but sturdy enough to last years, and many bore decorative carvings that turned them into minor works of art. To imagine a Viking pausing in the morning light to run such a comb through hair or beard is to see an act both intimate and public, one that tied the individual to a larger aesthetic tradition. Likewise, the frequent washing of hands and face, achievable even without full immersion bathing, would have been a simple but vital part of daily ritual, maintaining both personal comfort and the respect of peers. Interestingly, grooming also intersected with other aspects of Viking material culture. Scented oils, imported from abroad, and fragrant herbs could be used to wash or perfume hair and skin, lending a subtle sensory dimension to one's presence. These luxuries, available primarily to wealthier Vikings, added an extra layer of distinction much as fine clothing or jewelry might. Grooming tools themselves could be status symbols, while a simple bone comb was affordable to most. Those carved from walrus ivory or inlaid with metal fittings marked their owners as people of means. The portability of these items meant they traveled with their owners, carried along sea voyages, tucked among trade goods, or laid in graves to accompany the dead into the afterlife, where neatness and readiness were perhaps imagined as virtues even beyond this world. Contemporary foreign observers, whether monks chronicling raids or merchants describing market encounters, were often struck by this attention to appearance, which contrasted with the rougher stereotypes of barbarian life. These outsiders sometimes framed Viking grooming as a form of cunning, a way to charm or deceive, yet even in such biased accounts the underlying fact remained: the Northmen stood out for their care of themselves. This care, seen in the shine of clean hair, the tidy lines of a trimmed beard, and the absence of grime, undermines the popular myth of the Vikings as purely brutish marauders, and places them more accurately within the continuum of human cultures that have long understood grooming as a blend of practicality, pride and social maneuvering. And so, as the Viking world bustled on, markets opening at dawn, longships setting out to sea, families tending hearth and field, the comb's teeth continued their steady work, the shears made their precise snips, and the tweezers plucked away stray hairs, each action a small but telling affirmation that in this land of wind and wave, how one looked was never left entirely to chance. That same care extended downward, for no Viking ensemble, no matter how fine the tunic, or how gleaming the brooch, would have been complete without the footwear that bore its wearer across farm, forest and foreign shore. The long winters of the Viking world were not merely a matter of icy winds and frost underfoot, they were a season that demanded forethought, preparation, and a deep understanding of how to guard the human body against the relentless bite of cold. As the first snow began to fall, and the daylight hours dwindled to only a faint glimmer between the deep shadows of morning and evening, every household in the scattered farms and settlements turned its attention to winter gear. Among the most vital elements of a Viking's seasonal attire were hats, hoods and head coverings, practical in purpose yet carrying a cultural weight that reached beyond mere warmth. In the open fields or aboard a longship, a head covering could mean the difference between enduring the elements and succumbing to them, and the materials, shapes and decorative details of these coverings were chosen with careful thought. Wool was the most common base material, not only because it was plentiful and could be woven tightly enough to block the wind, but because it could also be felted, making it thicker and more resistant to both moisture and cold. A simple woolen cap, shaped close to the head and sometimes with a slight taper at the top, was a common sight among men who labored outdoors, its plainness reflecting utility over show. Yet even the most practical examples might have a touch of color from natural dyes, or a braided cord to secure it, small touches that hinted at a desire for individuality within necessity. For harsher weather, or for travel, the hood emerged as a particularly favored design, a garment that could be pulled low over the head, sometimes extending down to cover part of the shoulders and upper chest, creating a protective shell against wind and sleet. Some hoods were cut from wool and lined with fur, often sheepskin, which was accessible to most, though wealthier Vikings might line theirs with fox or beaver for superior warmth and a hint of status. A hood was not simply a loose covering. It was usually tailored to fit the wearer snugly, with a front opening that allowed it to be pulled over the head, yet sat close enough to block out gusts of freezing air. These were essential not only in the Scandinavian homelands, but also on long voyages, where a cold head and neck could quickly sap energy. Such practical garments, however, did not exist in isolation from the more symbolic and social aspects of Viking life. For Viking women, head coverings often carried a layer of meaning beyond protection from the cold. In many communities, the way a woman covered her hair could indicate her marital status, and married women were generally expected to keep their hair hidden in public, not for reasons of modesty in the modern sense, but as a marker of social role and respectability. Linen scarves, carefully folded and pinned in place, were common for everyday use, especially in milder seasons, though in winter these might be layered beneath a woolen hood for warmth. The scarf might be plain for day-to-day labor, but for market days, feasts or religious gatherings, the same woman might wear a finer head covering, perhaps trimmed with tablet-woven bands or edged with delicate stitching that signaled both skill and pride in presentation. Such garments blurred the line between utility and display, as they were worn in ways that were visible to others, and therefore became part of the unspoken language of Viking dress. Special occasions brought forth even more elaborate headwear, some of which could be considered true headdresses rather than mere coverings. Archaeological finds, combined with artistic depictions from runestones and foreign accounts, suggest that in wealthier households, women might wear caps adorned with silver thread, beadwork, or small metal plaques that glinted in firelight. These were not common, everyday items but rather pieces reserved for events where status and alliances were subtly on display. It is worth noting that such elaborate coverings required significant labor to produce, from the spinning and weaving of fine linen to the careful hand-stitching of decorative elements, making them not only precious in material, but also in the time invested. Men too had their more decorative headgear, though it tended to lean toward restrained craftsmanship rather than overt opulence. A man of means might own a fur-trimmed cap with a band of tablet-woven decoration around the base, or a hood with neatly stitched decorative seams. Such details spoke to the wearer's position without straying into impracticality, as the Viking world valued garments that could withstand hard use. The distinction between purely functional and status-driven attire was therefore often subtle, with wealth displayed through quality of materials and craftsmanship rather than flamboyant shapes or excessive ornamentation. These head coverings, whether plain woolen caps or intricate ceremonial headdresses, were deeply tied to the rhythm of Viking life and the demands of the seasons. They were donned before stepping out into the biting air, adjusted against the wind on a long walk to the fields, pulled down tightly against the spray on a sea voyage, or carefully arranged before entering the hall for a gathering. And in the quiet of the home, when the snow fell heavily outside, and the firelight flickered on the walls, they would be hung carefully by the hearth to dry, ready for the next day's use. This rhythm of wearing, tending and preparing one's head coverings mirrored the care taken with all garments, reflecting the Viking blend of necessity, resourcefulness, and a keen eye for the unspoken messages woven into everyday dress. That care extended, naturally, to the adornments and small personal effects that complemented clothing, and perhaps nowhere was this more evident than in the realm of belts and fastenings, which were far more than simple tools for holding garments in place. The clothing of Viking children was, in many ways, a mirror of the garments worn by their parents, though with fewer flourishes and simpler construction, shaped by the practical demands of childhood, in a world where rough play, outdoor chores, and the hazards of a working homestead were an everyday reality. From the earliest days, infants were wrapped in swaddling cloths, often made of soft wool or linen, if the family could afford it, or of course a homespun fabric in humbler households. The purpose was not merely to keep the child warm in the often chilly climate of Scandinavia, but also to provide a sense of security, and make it easier for mothers to carry them during daily work, whether indoors by the fire or outdoors tending to livestock. As the child grew into a toddler, clothing became a miniature version of adult attire, a simple tunic reaching to the knees, fastened at the waist with a thin belt or cord, paired with trousers or leggings for boys, and a long, apron-like overdress for girls, even at a very young age. The smaller scale did not mean lesser attention to warmth or durability. In fact, garments for children were often double-stitched, reinforced at knees and elbows, and made from older, repurposed family clothing, cut down and reshaped to fit growing bodies. Hand-me-downs were the norm, with a garment's life extending far beyond its first wearer. In a Viking household, clothing was too valuable to be wasted. If an adult tunic became too worn at the hems or cuffs, it might be taken apart. the strongest pieces salvaged for a child's tunic, while the more threadbare sections were turned into rags, or even used as stuffing in cushions. Linen underclothes, if available, were prized for their comfort, but also costly in terms of the labor required to produce flax, so they were often kept for special occasions or for children in the colder months, when warmth was critical. In the depths of winter, wool cloaks, sometimes lined with fur, or at least doubled for thickness, were fastened around the shoulders, and mittens were fashioned from scraps of sheepskin or thick felted wool. These mittens, tied to a cord that ran through the sleeves of a child's tunic, prevented them from being lost. A simple but clever trick that speaks to the everyday ingenuity of Viking parents. But clothing was not just about warmth and practicality. Even at a young age, children began to absorb the symbolic and social meanings woven into Viking garments. A little girl's apron dress, held by small but carefully made brooches, was a hint of the role she would one day take on as a woman, managing a household and holding the keys, quite literally, to its stores and supplies. For boys, wearing trousers or belted tunics like their fathers subtly marked their transition from toddler to young worker, signaling readiness to take on more responsibility, whether herding animals, gathering firewood, or helping in the fields. And while poorer families could not afford much in the way of ornament, wealthier households might outfit their children with a simple bead necklace or a small bronze pendant, perhaps as a charm for protection. These were not purely decorative. In a world where illness and danger lurked, such amulets could carry deep cultural and spiritual significance. Children's clothing also provided an early introduction to the skills that would define Viking textile production. From the time they could sit steadily and use their hands with precision, girls were encouraged to help with basic tasks like carding wool, twisting fibers, or winding spun yarn into balls. Boys too might assist in tasks such as soaking flax or tending to dye vats, especially if the family was engaged in larger-scale textile production for trade. These early lessons were often informal, woven into daily life, rather than taught in structured sessions. A mother might hand her daughter a small spindle and a handful of wool, while tending the cooking fire, encouraging her to try spinning even if the thread came out lumpy and uneven. In this way, textile skills were passed down not as abstract knowledge, but as living, practiced habits, embedded into the very rhythm of childhood. Play, too, reflected the textile-centered life of the Viking household. Children might imitate adults by weaving on toy looms, or by braiding scraps of yarn into cords for belts and ties. Small wooden needles, blunted for safety, could be used to teach basic sewing stitches, allowing a child to mend a simple tear in their own clothing under a parent's supervision. These early tasks gave children a sense of contribution to the household's survival, reinforcing the idea that clothing was not a disposable commodity, but a vital resource requiring time, skill, and cooperation to produce. In a way, each child's garment carried within its fibers a story of family labor: wool shorn from the household sheep, spun by a sister or aunt, woven by a mother or grandmother, and sewn into shape by experienced hands. The passing of seasons shaped children's clothing, just as it did for adults. Summer garments were lighter, with linen tunics that allowed freedom of movement in warmer weather, while winter demanded thick layering, fur-lined hoods, and sometimes waterproofed cloaks made from animal skins. In especially cold climates, children might wear boots stuffed with dried grass for insulation, a surprisingly effective technique that had been passed down through generations. Even the smallest members of the community learned early that survival in the north depended not only on bravery or strength, but on the quiet mastery of clothing as a barrier against the elements. This gradual introduction to the work and meaning of textiles meant that by the time a Viking child reached adolescence, they were already skilled in the essentials of clothing maintenance and production. Girls could spin, weave, and sew competently, while boys understood the value of good garments and the labor required to create them, knowledge that would serve them well whether they became farmers, traders, warriors, or craftspeople. In a culture where every stitch was hard-won, this shared understanding bound the community together, just as surely as the interwoven threads bound their garments. And so, as children ran through the fields or along the edges of the fjord, their clothing was more than a layer of fabric. It was a reflection of the household's skill, the family's resources, and the child's place within a living chain of tradition. The garments they wore, and the skills they learned were quiet threads connecting them to the past, and preparing them for the future, a constant reminder that in the Viking world, survival and identity were stitched together, one careful loop at a time. The sea was at the very heart of Viking life, and it was not a gentle neighbor. It could be calm and glassy under a low summer sun, but it could also turn to a roaring, foaming monster within a matter of hours, slamming its cold spray against the faces of those who dared to venture across it. For a people whose livelihoods, expansion and very identity were bound to their ships, clothing for the open water was not an afterthought, it was survival. On land, a Viking might wear garments tailored for warmth and appearance, but at sea, every stitch, every fastening, every layer had to serve a purpose. This was not a world of oilskin raincoats and modern waterproof boots. Instead, the Vikings had to make do with what nature and their own ingenuity could provide, crafting garments from the best materials available to stand between their bodies and the cold bite of the wind-driven waves. These voyages could last days, weeks, even months, and in that time the sea tested not only the strength of the ship, but also the durability of the sailor's clothing. The foundation of any seafaring outfit began with wool, and not just any wool, but carefully chosen, densely woven fabrics that were naturally resistant to water. Wool has a unique quality. Even when wet, it retains much of its insulating power, trapping air between its fibers. For a sailor facing relentless sea spray, this meant that a soaked tunic would not necessarily become a death sentence. A fine, tightly woven wool could even repel a surprising amount of moisture before becoming saturated, especially if treated with natural fats or oils. Many Viking sailors wore long-sleeved wool tunics over wool trousers, both designed with enough looseness for movement, but without excess fabric that could snag on rigging, or become heavy when wet. Linen, by contrast, was far less practical for open water. It absorbed water quickly, became heavy, and offered no warmth when wet, so it was generally reserved for undergarments, a softer layer against the skin, often dry at the start of the voyage, but inevitably damp after days at sea. Over these base garments came layers designed to block wind and shed water as much as possible. Cloaks were the most obvious addition, but a cloak for sea travel was not quite the same as one for walking across the fields back home. Some were treated with animal fats, fish oils, or even a mixture of tallow and beeswax to help them repel water. This made them smell less than pleasant by modern standards, but to a Viking sailor, the stench was a small price to pay for staying alive. The cut of these cloaks could vary. Some were half-length to allow easier movement on the deck, while others were full-length but pinned in such a way that the fabric could be shifted and adjusted quickly as weather changed. A good cloak could be drawn up high over the shoulders, and even over part of the head in place of a hood, though many seafarers also had dedicated head coverings. Hoods were an especially important feature for open water, as the head is one of the fastest ways the body loses heat. A sailor's hood might be made from the same heavy wool as his cloak, sometimes lined with fur for extra insulation. In the harshest conditions, fur itself could become the outermost layer, with hoods and capes made from the pelts of animals like fox, beaver, or seal, the latter offering an almost leather-like outer surface with excellent water resistance. Sealskin, in fact, was a valued material for sea travel, not just for hoods but for boots and mittens as well. While not every sailor had access to such luxury, those who did could enjoy a significant advantage when it came to keeping dry. Footwear for long voyages had to balance two competing needs: protection from water and the ability to grip the ship's wet, shifting surfaces. Simple leather shoes, common on land, would quickly soak through at sea. Instead, sailors often wore sturdier boots, sometimes knee-high, that could be treated with oils to make them more water-resistant. In particularly cold conditions, additional layers of felted wool might be stuffed inside the boots for warmth. The laces or fastenings were kept minimal and practical. Loose ends of leather thongs or cords could be dangerous near ropes and moving parts of the ship. Some accounts and archaeological finds suggest that sailors might even wrap their feet in extra lengths of woolen cloth before putting on their boots, creating an early form of layered sock insulation. Hands, too, needed protection. Rope work was constant aboard a Viking ship. Raising sails, adjusting rigging, hauling nets, and without gloves, the combination of salt water and rough fibers could shred skin quickly. Leather mittens lined with wool were likely in use, though some sailors preferred fingerless designs that allowed for better dexterity while still offering warmth to the palms. In the coldest waters, a fully enclosed mitten was warmer, but it was always a balance between heat and function. These were not luxury accessories but hard-worn, practical items that bore the scars of work at sea. Beyond the purely practical, there was an unspoken code of appearance even aboard a ship. Seaworthy clothing had to be functional. It could still bear small marks of personal pride, a stitched border on a hood, a colored thread woven into a cloak's fastening, or a decorative clasp that, while sturdy, also displayed a touch of craftsmanship. These touches reminded a sailor of home and identity, small comforts in the midst of an unforgiving environment. Sea voyages could also require clothing that adapted to rapid changes in weather. The North Atlantic was notoriously unpredictable. Sunshine could turn to sleet in the space of an hour. This meant that sailors often layered their garments in ways that allowed for quick adjustments. A cloak could be shrugged off and set aside if the air warmed, only to be pulled tight again when a cold wind rose from the waves. Wet layers might be swapped for dry spares if the voyage allowed for them, though often sailors simply endured dampness until they reached shore. Even sleeping aboard a ship required thought about clothing. On longer voyages, rest often came in short, fitful stretches, sometimes in open air, sometimes in cramped, covered areas. Sailors might wrap themselves in additional cloaks, or even share body heat under a single covering. In such conditions, clothing became part of survival strategy, not just daytime wear. Perhaps most telling is that Viking sailors did not dress for the sea in isolation from their daily life. These adaptations were simply an extension of the practical mindset they carried everywhere. Just as a farmer's garments were shaped by the needs of the field, a sailor's outfit evolved to meet the demands of the water. Over generations, knowledge of what worked best at sea became part of the culture, passed down from father to son, from seasoned helmsman to wide-eyed deckhand. And when the ship finally touched shore, the garments that had endured the salt, the spray, and the chill would tell their own stories, stiffened from salt water, frayed at the edges, but still serviceable, still warm, still very much alive with the memory of the crossing. From there, the sailor stepped onto solid land, only to find that clothing itself could shift again, becoming not just a shield against the sea, but a statement of presence in a world where first impressions mattered. The regional differences across the Viking world were subtle yet telling, an intricate weaving of climate, available resources, and cultural exchange that ensured no two Viking communities dressed quite the same. Although all shared the same overarching Norse traditions and practical approach to clothing, life in the coastal lowlands of Denmark bore little resemblance to the remote fjords of Norway, or the inland forests of Sweden, and those who settled far from the Scandinavian homeland, whether in the windswept Orkney Islands, the fertile plains of Ireland, or the river settlements of Eastern Europe, often adapted, and sometimes wholly transformed their attire to suit new environments. One might think of Viking fashion not as a rigid uniform, but as a tapestry that shifted with each region, stitched together by trade, necessity, and the unspoken desire to stand out just enough without forsaking the tried and tested styles that kept one alive through long winters and unpredictable weather. In Denmark, the warmer, flatter landscape and fertile soil meant milder winters than those endured by Norwegians or Swedes. Danish Vikings could afford to use lighter fabrics for much of the year, relying on linen for everyday garments and reserving heavier wool for winter. Trade hubs like Hedeby, one of the largest Viking Age towns, meant that Danes had easier access to imported textiles such as fine silk from the east or dyed wools from the British Isles. These fabrics weren't merely for display, though the wealthy made ample use of them for that purpose, but also signaled a kind of maritime cosmopolitanism, proof that one's ships traveled far and returned laden with goods. Bright reds, deep blues, and even patterned cloth were more common here, and these colors stood out vividly against the softer greens and browns of rural life. Norway's fjord settlements, on the other hand, were shaped by a far harsher climate. Winters were long, snow-deep, and winds bitter. So Norwegian clothing had to be layered and insulating. Heavy wool tunics and cloaks were standard, often lined with sheepskin or edged with fur from fox, hare, or even reindeer for added warmth. Leather was used extensively for boots, mittens and belts, and because of the proximity to rich hunting grounds, Norwegians had access to pelts that others could only obtain through trade. Even the wealthy here tended to value durability over flamboyance, though decorative elements were by no means absent. The wealthiest chieftains and their households wore garments dyed in strong colors and trimmed with exotic furs, but always with an eye toward withstanding the relentless cold. Sweden's inland and coastal settlements presented yet another variation. The Swedish Vikings, especially those who traveled eastward into what is now Russia and Ukraine, were deeply influenced by contact with the Slavic world and the Byzantine Empire. In towns like Birka, one of Sweden's most important trade centers, archaeologists have found evidence of garments incorporating silk bands, tablet-woven trims, and intricate embroidery, likely inspired by or directly imported from the East. These decorative touches were often applied to practical wool and linen garments, blending utility with prestige. Swedish clothing, particularly among wealthier merchants and warriors, may have featured more exotic patterns and fastenings than in other Scandinavian regions, showing off the spoils of long-distance trade routes along the rivers leading to the Black Sea. Once Viking explorers and settlers ventured abroad, the transformation of their wardrobes could be even more striking. In the British Isles, particularly in Ireland and Scotland, Norse settlers began to incorporate local fabrics and styles, including cloaks fastened differently, or made from native wool that had a distinct texture and quality. In the Orkney and Shetland Islands, isolation meant that wool from hardy local sheep became the primary textile, and garments were often thicker and coarser, prioritizing warmth and water resistance for life in a wet, windy climate. The Irish influence could be seen in patterns such as checks and stripes, which Vikings sometimes adopted into their tunics or cloaks, creating a visual blend of Norse and Gaelic traditions. Farther afield in the warmer climates of the Mediterranean, or along the rivers of Eastern Europe, Vikings adapted their clothing for heat as well as social display. In Constantinople, members of the Varangian Guard, Scandinavian warriors in service to the Byzantine Emperor, had access to silks, gold-threaded embroidery, and finely tailored tunics that would have been unimaginable in a remote Norwegian fishing village. These men sometimes returned home with these garments or their components, where they would be reworked into traditional Viking cuts, producing an unmistakable fusion of foreign luxury and local practicality. What remained constant across all these regional variations was the Viking emphasis on garments that worked with the body rather than against it. Even the most elaborate outfit was designed to allow freedom of movement for sailing, farming, or fighting, and layers could be added or removed as the weather dictated. Yet, the subtle changes in cut, fabric, dye, and ornament between regions spoke volumes about a person's origins, travels, and wealth. A man in Hedeby, wearing a tunic trimmed with eastern silk, was sending a very different message from a Norwegian fisherman in a heavy fur-lined cloak, though both belonged to the same broad cultural world. The beauty of Viking clothing lay not in rigid uniformity, but in its adaptability, a quality that mirrored the Vikings themselves. Just as they could thrive in the icy fjords of Greenland or the sunlit fields of southern France, their garments could shift and change, absorbing new influences without losing their essential Norse character. It was this blend of function and regional expression that made Viking fashion far richer and more varied than the popular image of uniform, fur-clad warriors might suggest, and it ensured that even at a glance, one could often tell where a person came from, or at least where they had been. And as these regional variations emerged, they naturally led to an even more fascinating question. How, in a world defined by sea voyages and trade, did the Vikings keep their clothing suited for the challenges of life on the open water, where salt spray, shifting winds, and weeks away from home demanded garments as rugged as the ships themselves? The influence of trade and raiding on Viking clothing was far greater than most casual observers might expect. For while the image of the Norse seafarer often calls to mind woolen tunics and practical cloaks suited to the biting winds of the north, The truth is that the Vikings were not merely warriors or farmers, but also consummate merchants and opportunists who wove the riches of the wider world into their daily lives, quite literally, through the fabric they wore. Indeed, as their longships ventured far beyond the Scandinavian fjords, each port they touched, each market they entered, and each palace they plundered, brought with it not only coins and goods, but also threads of foreign influence that subtly, yet powerfully, transformed their wardrobes. From the east came the shimmering marvel of silk, a fabric so rare and prized in the north, that a scrap of it, barely enough to wrap around the hand, might be preserved as a family treasure. Such silks often originated in Byzantium, or even further along the Silk Road, passing through multiple hands before reaching the far coasts of Norway or Sweden, and they were typically traded in narrow strips, too precious to be used for an entire garment, yet ideal for trimming the edges of cloaks or decorating the front of a tunic, so that even the simplest outfit might bear the unmistakable sheen of luxury that spoke of distant lands and extraordinary wealth. From the Islamic world came not only silks, but also intricate patterned textiles, woven with a precision that Viking looms could not yet achieve, along with brilliant dyes derived from exotic sources. Deep blues made richer with indigo from India, reds extracted from cochineal or madder roots, cultivated far to the south, and yellows so vivid, they seemed to catch the sunlight even in the gloom of a northern winter. Such colors were more than mere decoration, for in a society where fabric production was laborious and dyes costly, wearing a cloak lined with foreign cloth, or a tunic banded in crimson, was as clear a signal of status as carrying an ornate sword, or wearing a finely worked arm ring. The Western voyages brought their own share of influence, for raids on the monasteries and towns of the British Isles sometimes yielded more than silver chalices and reliquaries. They yielded chests of ecclesiastical vestments, heavy with gold thread and embroidered with religious motifs. Though the Vikings had no interest in the Christian saints depicted upon them, the fabrics themselves were cut, repurposed, and incorporated into Viking garments in ways that erased their original context, but preserved their opulence, allowing a chieftain's wife to wear a gown edged with cloth, once meant to drape an altar, or a warrior to fasten his cloak with a brooch threaded through a band that had once been part of a bishop's robe. These goods did not arrive only by violence. The Vikings were skilled traders, and many of the same ports they raided in one season they returned to in another, as merchants, bringing with them furs, walrus ivory, amber, and finely worked metal goods in exchange for fabrics and dyes. In bustling markets from Dublin to Novgorod, they learned the preferences of foreign buyers, and in turn absorbed the styles they saw around them, sometimes imitating them closely, sometimes blending them with their own traditions in ways that created new hybrid fashions unique to the Viking world. Even the practical elements of clothing were influenced by these encounters, for foreign tailoring techniques and new types of fastenings gradually found their way into Scandinavian dress. The straight-cut tunics and trousers of earlier generations began to give way, among the wealthier classes, to garments with slightly more shaping and fitted sleeves, innovations that likely came from contact with cultures further south, where clothing was designed with more attention to the human form, while imported buttons, clasps, and patterned tablet-woven bands offered both functional and decorative possibilities previously unknown in the north. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this influence was its subtlety, for while the overall silhouette of Viking dress remained rooted in their own traditions, the small details told stories of far-off places: a border of patterned silk at the hem of a wool cloak, a sash dyed in a hue impossible to produce in the north, or a brooch whose form echoed Frankish metalwork rather than Scandinavian. Such details served as visible markers of the wearer's connections, wealth, and experience, and in a world where status was always on display, they were as important as the quality of one's ship, or the size of one's farmstead. And so, as Viking ships continued their restless journeys along rivers and coasts, each return home brought not only the tangible spoils of silver and gold, but also the intangible wealth of ideas, styles, and techniques, which once absorbed into Scandinavian life, became part of the fabric of their identity. Quite literally, in the garments they wore, and from this blending of the local and the foreign emerged a distinct fashion language that spoke of both the cold northern seas and the warm markets of the south, of both the loom in the farmhouse and the merchant's stall in a distant city. It was in this rich context of exchange, adaptation and quiet transformation that the influence of foreign fabrics naturally bled into the Viking love for embellishment. For once new materials were in their hands, it was only natural to adorn them further, which leads seamlessly into the world of embroidery and decorative techniques that elevated even the simplest woolen tunic into a work of art. The Viking world, for all its rugged landscapes and brutal winters, was a society acutely aware of the visual language of clothing, a culture where garments could serve as silent proclamations of identity, wealth, and position. To the untrained eye, Viking attire might seem purely practical: woolen tunics, leather belts, fur cloaks, and sturdy boots, designed only to shield against the biting cold and unforgiving wind. Yet, beneath that outer layer of practicality, lay a deep and deliberate system of social signaling, where the weight of a cloak's fabric, the hue of a tunic, or the gleam of a brooch could quietly announce a person's rank, influence, or connections. In a time when words could be fleeting and records scarce, clothing became a kind of enduring script, read instantly by anyone versed in its codes. For the wealthy jarls, the land-owning chieftains who commanded ships, warriors, and far-flung trade routes, clothing was as much about spectacle as it was about comfort. Their garments were often cut from the finest wool, tightly woven, so that the cloth held both warmth and shape. Some owned imported fabrics such as silk from Byzantium, or fine linen from the Frankish lands, each bolt a costly luxury that might have passed through many hands before reaching Scandinavian shores. These materials did not merely clothe the body, they were physical proof of a jarl's reach, of ships sent across seas and alliances forged beyond the northern horizon. A deep crimson cloak might signal wealth not only because of its expensive dye, but also because it declared the ability to commission such finery when others could only dream of it. The colors themselves carried weight in the social hierarchy. All undyed wool in shades of brown, grey, and cream clothed most farmers and laborers. The higher classes could afford vibrant tones, blues made from woad or imported indigo, and reds drawn from madder or costly cochineal, required both skill and resources to produce. To wear such colors was to make a statement about prosperity and influence, for every bright garment hinted at the number of sheep needed to yield the wool, the labor of spinners and weavers, and the skill of dyers who transformed dull fibers into eye-catching hues. The wealthy might further embellish their clothing with intricate embroidery, worked in silk or metallic threads, the patterns reflecting both artistic taste and the ability to spare the time and labor such decoration required. Beyond fabric and color, adornments were powerful indicators of standing. Ornate brooches, often made of bronze, silver, or even gold, fastened cloaks and overdresses while serving as portable wealth, each one a miniature display of craftsmanship. A wealthy trader returning from a voyage might wear arm rings of twisted silver, their surfaces polished to catch the light, while a skilled warrior might display a finely worked sword belt or scabbard fittings engraved with knotwork designs. These items could be exchanged, melted down, or given as gifts in alliances, but in daily life they served to make social rank instantly visible. For traders and skilled artisans, clothing was often a careful balance between functionality and subtle display. A well-traveled merchant might wear a wool tunic of fine weave dyed in rich but not ostentatious shades, paired with a sturdy leather belt hung with small tools, pouches, and perhaps a dagger. The cut and finish of the tunic would distinguish him from farmers, but its practicality would show that he valued movement and utility. Such a man's prestige came not only from his possessions but from his ability to navigate the shifting spaces between markets and mead halls, to look respectable without appearing as though he sought to compete directly with the aristocracy. Meanwhile, for the majority of Vikings, the farmers, herders, and laborers who formed the backbone of society, clothing remained rooted in necessity. Wool from local sheep, spun and woven by household members, formed the bulk of their attire. Tunics and trousers for men, overdresses for women, and plain cloaks were common, the colors muted by the limited dyes they could produce at home. These garments were durable, designed for work in fields, forests, or along rocky shores. Though simple in cut and decoration, they were still carefully maintained, for even among the lower ranks, appearance mattered in public gatherings, at seasonal markets, or during religious festivals. A well-kept cloak or neatly repaired tunic could signal personal pride and competence, even without costly embellishments. It is important to remember that status markers were not static. They shifted with circumstance and context. A farmer might wear his best tunic, dyed with locally sourced plant colors, when attending a feast hosted by his lord, while a jarl might don simpler garb for a long sea voyage, valuing mobility over display. The same person could appear humbly clothed one day, and richly adorned the next, depending on the audience they wished to impress, or the task at hand. Clothing in the Viking world was thus a flexible language, not fixed in rigid categories, but adapted to speak differently in different settings. Gender also played a role in how status was displayed. Wealthy women, especially the wives or daughters of jarls, had access to high-quality fabrics, elaborate apron dresses fastened with ornate brooches, and strings of imported glass or amber beads. These items not only signaled their family's wealth, but also their role as keepers of household prestige. The richness of a woman's attire reflected well on her household, implying a level of domestic organization and resource management that extended beyond simple decoration. In weddings, feasts, and religious ceremonies, such clothing took on even greater significance, marking moments of public visibility, where social hierarchies were reinforced through sight as much as through speech. What emerges from this picture is a society deeply attuned to the communicative power of clothing. Even in a culture often romanticized for its roughness, there was an acute understanding that garments could signal authority, success, or belonging in ways that words could not. To layering of fine fabrics, the gleam of a silver arm ring, the richness of a red cloak, each of these could draw subtle lines between those who ruled, those who traded, and those who labored. And yet, for all its social weight, Viking dress was never divorced from practicality. Even the most splendid cloak had to withstand wind, rain, and snow. The result was a visual culture, where status and survival were woven together, each garment a blend of necessity and symbolism. That blend was especially visible when Vikings traveled, for the sea was not merely a route of conquest and trade, but a stage upon which identity was performed before foreign eyes. This meant that even the clothing worn aboard ships, though functional, carried its own signals, a merging of practicality and prestige, that told as much about the wearer's standing as about the journey they were undertaking. And so as the oars dipped into cold grey water and sails caught the northern wind, the garments chosen for such voyages became their own kind of message, both to fellow crew members and to those awaiting them across distant shores. In the lives of the Norse people, the boundaries between the sacred and the everyday were far less rigid than in the later, more structured societies of medieval Europe, and yet there were moments when clothing became a deliberate and potent expression of belief, devotion, and communal identity. These were the moments of gathering, feasts to honor the turning of the seasons, weddings that bound two families in oath and fortune, and religious rites that sought the favor of the gods, or gave thanks for their perceived blessings. On such occasions, the garments worn were chosen not merely for comfort or warmth, but for the messages they carried, messages woven into the fabric itself through color, cut, material, and adornment. One could imagine the scene on the morning of a great feast, perhaps in the early spring when the long dark of winter had finally broken, and the air held the first hint of thaw. Villagers would emerge from their longhouses, not in their workaday wool and worn leather, but in garments carefully stored away for just such events. These pieces, often preserved with care for many years, were taken out only on important occasions, their colors still rich, their embroidery still sharp against the fabric. The wearers might feel a certain pride as they fastened brooches polished to a fine gleam, or smoothed the folds of a tunic, dyed in a shade far too costly to wear in the fields. Color played a role of quiet but profound symbolism. Deep reds, derived from madder root and sometimes enhanced with imported cochineal, could signify vitality, wealth, and protection. a hue favored for feasts and for garments worn during rituals to honor Thor, whose fiery aspect was thought to guard against harm. Blue, achieved through the careful fermentation of woad, carried associations with calm, stability, and sometimes even the realm of the divine, making it a fitting choice for ceremonies dedicated to Njord or Freyr, deities tied to prosperity and peace. Yellow, taken from weld or birch leaves, might appear in accents and embroidery, suggesting warmth and light, an echo of the returning sun. The wealthier the wearer, the more saturated and even the color, for rich dyes were labor-intensive and costly to produce. Materials, too, could signal the nature of the occasion and the status of the participants. While the everyday farmer wore wool and linen, ritual clothing might incorporate finer, more tightly woven textiles, or in rare cases, fabrics imported through trade, silk from the east, patterned cloth from the Frankish kingdoms, or even damask from distant Byzantium. A chieftain's wife attending a midwinter blot might wear a wool overdress, lined with fur, and trimmed with silk ribbon acquired through a merchant's voyage to Hedeby or Birka, the small flashes of exotic fabric catching the light of the hall's torches. The feel of such materials against the skin, softer and more supple than coarse homespun, would remind both wearer and onlooker of wealth, connection, and influence. The cut and layering of garments could shift subtly for these events. For men, tunics might be longer, reaching to the knee, or even mid-calf, with decorative bands sewn at the hems and cuffs. Belts might be adorned with intricate bronze or silver fittings, not merely to hold a sword but to show off fine craftsmanship. Cloaks, usually a practical defense against cold, became part of the spectacle, draped just so across one shoulder, and fastened with a brooch whose form might echo a myth, a stylized serpent for Jörmungandr, or a motif drawn from the knotwork of Thor's hammer. Women's dresses might feature longer straps for the apron dress, allowing the fabric beneath to billow gracefully, and the brooches fastening them could be the finest owned, heavy with metalwork, and perhaps strung with glass beads, amber, or even rare carnelian. Jewelry in these contexts carried more than decorative weight. Arm rings given as bride gifts might be worn prominently at weddings, a visible token of a man's oath to provide and protect. Necklaces of carefully arranged beads could function as protective charms, as much as ornament, their arrangement holding personal or family meaning. In some rituals, amulets were worn openly, such as a Thor's hammer pendant for protection during important communal gatherings, or small figurines of deities kept close to the skin. These items, visible in the flickering torchlight of a feast hall, or in the pale glow of an outdoor ceremony, served as unspoken declarations of faith, allegiance, and hope for divine favor. Footwear was often more elaborate for ceremonial wear than for daily life. While a farmer's boots might be plain and utilitarian, shoes worn to a wedding could have tooled leather patterns or decorative stitching along the seams, both to please the eye and to mark the importance of the day. A high-status man might have footwear dyed or treated with oils to give it a lustrous sheen, while a woman might wear soft leather slippers lined with fur for warmth and comfort, the hidden luxury known only to herself and those close enough to notice. Ritual and religious clothing also carried a practical role in aiding memory and tradition. In communities where oral storytelling was the primary way to pass down history and belief, visual markers helped reinforce meaning. A child might remember that during the harvest feast, the priestess always wore the same cloak with its gold thread trim, or that the groom's family at a wedding wore matching blue tunics. Over time, these garments became part of the community's collective imagery, reinforcing the cycle of tradition from one generation to the next. It is worth noting that in the Viking world, the concept of religious dress was not limited to the sphere of the gods of Asgard. As Christianity began to seep into the northern lands through trade, diplomacy and conquest, new garments appeared in ritual settings. Crucifixes worn alongside Thor's hammers, tunics with cross-shaped embroidery, and imported ecclesiastical fabrics repurposed for feasts. These blended wardrobes tell a story not only of faith, but of a culture in transition, willing to adopt, adapt, and reframe clothing to suit the layered beliefs of the people. In such a context, the act of dressing for a ritual or feast was never casual. It was an act of participation, a way of stepping into a role, be it worshipper, host, witness, or celebrant. Each item worn, from the color of the wool to the clasp at the throat, was a statement, both personal and communal. And when the gathering was over, and the garments carefully returned to their storage chests, the memory of the event lingered in the minds of those who had seen and been seen, until the next time the hall was filled with song, light, and the rustle of fine cloth. Beneath the woolen tunics, the linen overdresses, and the richly dyed cloaks, there existed a quieter, less visible layer of Viking clothing that, though seldom spoken of in sagas or carved into stone, was nonetheless essential to comfort, warmth, and modesty in a world where climate and practicality dictated much of daily life. Archaeological finds from Viking Age sites rarely reveal much about these undergarments, not because they did not exist, but because the delicate fabrics from which they were made, often finely spun linen or other plant-based fibers, simply did not survive the damp, acidic soils of Scandinavia and its outlying settlements. What we know today is built from fragments, a shred of cloth clinging to a brooch pin, an outline preserved in the corrosion of a metal fastener, or the rare and precious textile found in waterlogged graves, preserved only by chance. From these clues, a picture emerges of garments that were never meant to be seen by outsiders, but that played a constant role in the lives of Viking men, women, and children. For men, the base layer may have been something akin to a long linen shirt, reaching mid-thigh or even the knees, with a loose, breathable weave that allowed air to circulate against the skin. In the summer months, when the sun lingered in the northern sky and temperatures could grow surprisingly warm, this underlayer would have been light and thin, perhaps worn alone when laboring in the fields or aboard a ship, then covered with tunics and trousers when duty or modesty required. In winter, however, these shirts would have been heavier, woven with tighter threads, and sometimes paired with long linen drawers or shorts, to create a barrier between the skin and the rougher, heavier woolens worn above. Linen, unlike wool, did not itch, and in a society that valued practicality, that comfort was not merely a luxury, but a daily necessity. Women, too, would have had their own undergarments, perhaps similar in design to the simple linen shifts worn in other parts of medieval Europe. These would have fallen to the ankles, with narrow sleeves or sleeveless designs, depending on the season, and would have been worn beneath the more structured woolen overdress and apron dress. This not only added a layer of warmth, but also served a protective purpose, preventing body oils and sweat from staining the more valuable and time-consuming to make outer garments. Linen could be washed more frequently than wool, and in an age before soap as we know it, garments that could survive repeated laundering were worth their weight in gold. The shift also served a modesty function, ensuring that a woman was never truly unclothed, even when her outer garments were removed for sleeping or laborious chores. Children, as with so many aspects of Viking life, wore scaled-down versions of adult garments, and their underclothes would have been no different. A young boy might wear a short linen shirt that reached just above the knee, while a girl's shift might be a smaller copy of her mother's. These undergarments not only provided comfort, but also acted as a kind of training ground, teaching children from a young age the layered dress system that would accompany them through life. By the time they reached adulthood, the act of donning an underlayer, then an overlayer, then fastening cloaks, belts, and brooches, was as instinctive as breathing. The question of undergarments extends beyond comfort into the realm of hygiene and social perception. While some modern depictions of Vikings lean heavily into the image of the rough, unwashed barbarian, surviving artifacts such as combs, ear spoons, tweezers, and even small-lidded boxes for personal care items suggest a society that placed considerable importance on cleanliness. Linen underclothes played a role in this, absorbing sweat and grime, and allowing the more difficult-to-clean woolens to remain fresher for longer. These base garments could be boiled or scrubbed far more easily than a heavy cloak or tunic, meaning that a Viking could present themselves respectably even after long days of work or travel. When it came to materials, linen remained the favored choice for underclothing due to its softness, breathability, and ability to wick moisture away from the skin. Flax plants from which linen was made grew well in parts of Scandinavia, and the skills to process flax into fine thread were widespread. The work was slow and painstaking, requiring the stems to be retted, soaked to loosen the fibers, then beaten, combed, and spun before weaving could even begin. but the result was a cloth that was not only practical but also pleasant to wear, a small daily comfort in a landscape that could be unrelentingly harsh. In some regions, especially those with more trade connections, other plant-based fabrics may have made occasional appearances, though these would have been rare and likely reserved for the wealthy. The wealthier classes, jarls and prosperous merchants, may have had undergarments of especially fine weave, soft against the skin, and perhaps even lightly embroidered at the edges where they might be glimpsed at the collar or cuffs. Some might have had decorative tablet-woven trim to reinforce seams, not because others would see it, but because in a culture where clothing was valued and cared for, even the hidden garments could be made to last. For the poor, underclothes would have been more utilitarian, patched and mended repeatedly, sometimes passed down within families until the fabric grew thin and threadbare. In both cases, the value of these garments lay less in their appearance and more in their function, a quiet, steadfast layer between the body and the world. There is also the intriguing question of whether Vikings wore anything akin to modern underpants. Evidence is scant, but some textile finds from other early medieval cultures suggest that loincloths or short breeches may have been worn, particularly during travel or labor-intensive work. In the Viking world, such items might have been made from scraps of linen, or even softened leather, tied with simple cords at the waist. The absence of abundant archaeological evidence does not mean they were absent in life. It simply means they did not survive the long centuries in the soil. Even in the matter of sleep, these underclothes may have served a dual purpose. A Viking might not have changed entirely into separate nightclothes, but instead loosened or removed their heavier outer garments and slept in their linen shift or shirt, the fabric serving as both a sleeping garment and a base layer to rise and dress from quickly in the morning. In longhouses where warmth was shared communally and privacy was limited, such practices would have been practical as well as modest. The hidden world of underclothes, then, is a reminder that even in an age defined by its outer trappings, its shining brooches, patterned tunics and fur-lined cloaks, there was an equally important layer of daily life that seldom reached the eye. These garments, though unremarkable in appearance, were the quiet foundation upon which all other clothing rested, ensuring comfort, warmth and cleanliness in a challenging climate. Without them, the elegance and utility of Viking dress as we imagine it would not have been possible, for every fine wool tunic and every rich silk trim depended on these humble unseen companions to protect them from the wear and tear of life. And just as these garments bridged the gap between body and outer world, they also bridged the space between the intimate and the public, the private routines of dressing each morning, and the confident stride into the day. They may have been hidden from view, but in their absence, the Viking world would have been a colder, rougher, and far less comfortable place. In considering the clothing placed upon the dead in Viking burials, one enters a space where fabric and thread take on meanings far beyond mere warmth or beauty, becoming silent expressions of love, respect and belief in what lay beyond this life. The grave was not simply a resting place but a passage, and the clothing chosen for that journey was an intimate reflection of how the living understood both the dead and the unseen world they imagined awaited them. Archaeological finds from ship burials, mound graves, and even modest earth-dug pits offer a patchwork of evidence, sometimes tantalizingly complete, sometimes frustratingly fragmentary, but together they reveal a culture in which clothing for the dead was chosen with care, reflecting social status, personal identity, and deeply held spiritual expectations. In grand burials such as the famed Oseberg ship, the dead were dressed in garments rich with embroidery, woven in fine wool, or rare imported silks, their colors vivid even after centuries in the earth, suggesting that beauty and opulence were thought to be as fitting in death as in life, perhaps even more so, if the journey to the afterlife was imagined as a voyage requiring one's finest appearance. Yet not all graves speak of wealth. Many reveal simple work garments, patched and plain, perhaps the only clothing available, but perhaps also chosen, because these were the clothes most associated with the person in life, a practical and personal kind of honor. The choice of burial garments also appears to have varied according to regional traditions, local resources, and the season in which death occurred. In colder climates, the dead might be wrapped in multiple layers of wool, fur-lined cloaks, and heavy mantles, ensuring warmth in the symbolic sense, not because the dead felt cold, but because the living sought to give them comfort for the long journey ahead. In some cases, the clothing seems deliberately ceremonial, belts adorned with metal fittings, brooches of fine craftsmanship, and even elaborate headdresses, all placed with deliberate positioning, suggesting ritual significance. There is also evidence from grave goods and garment fragments that certain colors carried meaning, deep blues and reds appearing more often in higher status burials, perhaps because such dyes were costly and carried connotations of power, vitality, or divine favor. Yellow, produced from local plants, might have been more common in everyday dress, yet still appears in burial contexts, hinting at symbolic associations with light or renewal. For the Vikings, clothing in death was not an isolated element. It formed part of a larger assemblage of goods, tools, weapons, and personal items intended to accompany the deceased into the next world. Just as a warrior might be buried with his sword or a shipwright with his tools, so too was a person dressed in garments that told the story of who they had been, and perhaps who they hoped to be in the afterlife. The sagas and skaldic poetry, while composed later, hint at beliefs in continued feasting, travel, and fellowship beyond death, scenes in which one would surely wish to arrive well clad, even in more humble graves, where the fabric has decayed almost entirely. Traces of metal fastenings, beads, or textile impressions in the soil tell us that clothing was present and meaningful. These remnants remind us that for the Vikings, death did not strip a person of their identity, rather it was an occasion to reaffirm it, using the same language of cloth, color, and craft that had shaped their life. And so, whether in silken splendor or in the humble weave of everyday wool, Viking burial clothing stands as a final statement, part farewell, part hope, and part preparation for a journey whose destination lay beyond the reach of the living eye. The clothing of the Vikings, so often imagined as a timeless and unchanging uniform of tunics, cloaks, and boots, was in reality part of a living tradition that shifted subtly but steadily across the centuries, shaped by the slow turning of the social and cultural wheel. In the earliest centuries of the Viking Age, dress was rooted in older Scandinavian traditions, garments cut for movement, warmth, and resilience, with materials and dyes drawn from the land itself, and fastenings made by the same hands that spun and wove the fabric. But as decades passed, the Viking world was no longer only the domain of seafaring raiders and remote farmers. Trade routes widened, linking northern settlements to the courts of Byzantium, the markets of the Frankish kingdoms, and the ports of the eastern rivers. Each journey brought more than silver and spices. It brought new fabrics, new cuts, new colors, and new ideas about what clothing could say about the person who wore it. Slowly the lines of the old garments softened or sharpened in imitation of foreign fashions. Imported silk began to find its way into the trimming of cloaks or the lining of hoods, and new fastening styles replaced or supplemented the older oval brooches. These were small shifts at first, a border of patterned braid here, a foreign clasp there, but they signaled the beginning of a transformation. The coming of Christianity to the north accelerated this change, not by sweeping away old ways overnight, but by introducing new norms that seeped into everyday dress over generations. Church leaders and missionaries often emphasized modesty, and while Viking dress had never been immodest in the sense of bareness, the Christian ideal promoted certain silhouettes and coverings, especially for women. Head coverings became more common, not just as protection from the cold, but as a marker of propriety. Bright pagan symbols, once stitched or woven into garments, gave way to crosses and plain geometric patterns, though many older motifs persisted quietly in rural areas far from the reach of new religious authority. Christianity also brought with it the rhythms of settled farming life, tied closely to church calendars and festivals, and these new social structures influenced what was worn and when. Feast days, for example, became occasions to wear one's finest imported cloth, or the carefully stored garments brought out only for rare celebrations, while ordinary days saw more subdued and practical wear. Trade, meanwhile, reshaped not just the appearance but the very texture of Viking clothing. The Baltic and North Seas became busy arteries carrying dyed linens from the Low Countries, fine wool from the British Isles, and patterned silk from the East. Such materials were often combined with local woolens to create hybrid garments that spoke of both tradition and novelty. Some tunics were cut a little shorter or narrower to reflect continental styles. Belts might be worn differently, or edged with metalwork inspired by Frankish designs. These changes were not uniform across the Viking world. What a trader in Hedeby wore might be quite different from a farmer in a remote fjord, but the general trend was toward more variety, more layers, and greater refinement in finishing techniques. Over time, even the colors in use shifted. While natural browns, grays, and undyed whites remained staples, brighter hues like deep red and blue became more accessible as imported dyestuffs circulated through northern markets, changing the visual palette of daily life. By the later centuries of the Viking Age, the very idea of Viking dress had become more complex than it had been in the days of the first voyages west. A man might still wear a woolen tunic, trousers, and a cloak, but the cut, stitching, and decoration might owe as much to distant lands as to ancestral custom. Or women's dresses might incorporate new layered styles, with undertunics of fine linen and overdresses edged with colored silk or tablet-woven bands in patterns that had crossed half a continent to arrive in the north. Even the humble work garments of farmers and craftsmen began to reflect improved tailoring techniques learned from contact with other cultures, allowing for better fit and movement. Yet for all these changes, there remained a core of continuity: the practical layering against cold, the reliance on wool and linen, the skill of local weaving that tied each generation to the one before. This gradual shift in Viking clothing tells the quiet story of a people in motion, not just across seas but through time, adapting to new influences without entirely surrendering the old. The transition was neither abrupt nor universal. It was a slow weaving in of new threads into the old cloth, until the pattern of Viking life, and the garments that clothed it, reflected both the world they had inherited and the world they were becoming. By the dawn of the medieval kingdoms that followed, the stark, functional dress of early raiders had softened into something more courtly, more cosmopolitan, yet still recognizably northern. The tunics and cloaks, though altered in cut and cloth, still carried the echo of wind over salt water, the weight of winter frost, and the memory of hands that spun and stitched in the long light of a northern summer. In the centuries since the last true Viking ships set sail, the image of how these northern people dressed has drifted like a woolen cloak carried on the wind, reshaped not only by the fading of memory, but also by the stories others chose to tell about them. The truth, as preserved in the soil, in the graves, and in the quiet evidence of cloth fragments and brooches, speaks of a world far more intricate, colorful, and quietly elegant than the horned helmet caricatures that often parade across our screens. In popular culture, Vikings are draped in endless furs, leather straps, and dark, battle-stained garments, a look that, while visually dramatic, strips away the layered linen tunics, the bright blues from woad, the gold thread embroidery, and the polished silver pins that once caught the sun. The real Viking dress was not a single uniform style but a living language of material, craft, and meaning. Every stitch an answer to the cold, every fastening a blend of necessity and beauty, every color a reflection of trade routes, status, and personal pride. Over time, the weaving of this truth into the tapestry of history has loosened, the threads fraying as myths replaced details, and as the people who once knew the feel of wool under their fingertips faded into the mist of the past. Yet the patient work of archaeologists, textile experts, and historians stitches some of those threads back into place, revealing that Viking fashion was never merely about keeping warm. It was about identity, belonging, and the subtle display of one's place in the world. And so, as the modern imagination continues to paint its own versions of these seafaring people, the real fabrics, the real colors, and the real shapes emerge again from the ground, reminding us that history's truest clothing is always tailored from the patience to look closer. And in this way, the story of Viking dress becomes more than just a tale of what people wore long ago. It becomes a reminder of how easily the past can be reshaped in our minds, and how important it is to preserve the quiet truths before they unravel completely. Like a garment carefully folded away in a chest, waiting for another set of hands to unfold it and feel its texture, the history of what the Vikings wore rests in our keeping now. a legacy of threads that still whisper across 1,000 years, carrying with them the warmth, the pride, and the enduring human desire to wrap oneself not only in fabric, but in meaning.